1999, wrestler Chris Benoit, a.k.a. the Canadian Crippler, was wowing audiences with his signature flying headbutt. While Chris worked the crowds of the WCW, his old friend Owen Hart landed a coveted spot in the widely popular WWE managed by Vince McMahon. During the league cutthroat race for ratings, Owen agreed to perform a dangerous stunt.
He was supposed to perform a stunt on a cable, and I don't know if the cable broke or if he accidentally hit his release, and he fell from the top of the ceiling into the ring, and he died right in the middle of the pay-per-view. It was so sad, and even the fact that they kept the show going, they shouldn't. Like, if a wrestler dying can't stop the show, what can?
We were just sitting down to have dinner at my parents' house. We always had Sunday dinners, and we got the phone call that Owen had fallen from a great distance and landed badly, and we didn't know how serious it was. And when we got the news of this, we were just shocked. And then minutes later, the second call came that he had died, as a result of the fall. And it was, very devastating.
It just seemed like the weirdest, worst possible thing that could have happened to the whole family. That it would happen in wrestling. Like, you think it could have just been a car accident. It would have been so much less, been easier on everybody, for sure. I think it affected everybody in a horrible way.
Something that never ever should have happened, and that made it harder to accept. It made it seem more senseless, more avoidable.
Shaken by the accident, Chris returned to Calgary to console the Harts as they buried their youngest son.
Well, anyone who wrestled at the dungeon, who wrestled with the Hart family, I think they all became like a family. It was that kind of environment. Owen's death was extremely tragic. It was a really difficult time. I'm sure Chris felt like Owen was his family.
After the funeral, Chris returned to his busy schedule. On January 16, 2000, he defeated wrestler Sid Vicious and took home WCW's World Heavyweight title. The gold-plated belt was followed by an invitation to join Vince McMahon's WWE. Despite the death of his friend Owen, Chris accepted the offer.
The opportunity to make very big money and have that TV exposure was really too hard for the wrestlers to pass up.
Chris Benoit was the hardest working guy I ever knew in the business. I mean, Chris would do things night in and night out. When the pay-per-view is on and people are paying, he would give them every dime that they put into that. And he did the same thing in a house show with no cameras.
You can do it. If you believe in yourself, you've got the will, you got the drive, you got the desire, you have the passion, you can do it. And, it's a testimony.
I thought that Chris was so money, because every match he did, he went out there and you knew he wasn't going to say, no, I'm not doing that. Chris would go, okay, and let's do this too. And that's the way he was. And jumping off that top cage, just 20 feet in the air, doing the headbutt, he would do that. I mean, crazy stuff, But it was like he was superhuman.
As Chris's career took off, his relationship with girlfriend Nancy heated up.
Everybody who knew them will say that there was a lot of passion. With a lot of passion, you get ups and downs, but they were very much in love and probably fueled by the way it all started. So I know things moved very quickly for them.
There's a lot of wrestling romances, but a lot of people thought this was one that was pretty real and was going to last.
On February 25, 2000, Nancy gave birth to Daniel Christopher Benoit. 8 months later, the couple married.
Chris Benoit had the cutest baby that I used to giggle. Because when I saw the baby, it was like a little miniature Chris Benoit.
Chris adored Daniel. Didn't love him, adored him.
Chris's grueling schedule meant he was constantly on the road, away from his family.
They really did have a killer calendar where they would be on the road for 36, 48 days straight, never getting home.
If you want to be a professional wrestler, you got to be dedicated to the training and be willing to do what it takes that the promoter wants you to do.
It becomes really exhausting for these guys to not only the abuse of their bodies on the road, without proper food or maybe not getting to the gym all the time, but it's also your time away from your family and your friends and your loved ones at home.
To go through the schedule that we go through, because it's not like we have an off season. We're year-round, 365 days a year.
When I talked to Chris on the phone, he complained about being so tired, the rigors of wrestling on the road.
But as soon as you talk about Daniel, his voice would just perk right up.
Chris's sacrifices paid off. In April of 2000, he won his first WWE Intercontinental Championship.
Chris Benoit held the World Heavyweight Championship title in both the WCW and the WWE, and those are huge, huge accomplishments.
But in June of 2001, Benoit suffered a severe neck injury that forced him out of the spotlight.
Even though it is like sort of a stunt, man, you learn to fall properly and stuff like that. That jars your body after a while. It was just hard, really hard on his body, and I think after a while it deteriorated his bones and his muscles.
Chris wasn't any different than a lot of his colleagues, where his neck took a lot of abuse, and it ends up sort of compacting and to the point where he couldn't perform anymore, and so they had to operate on his neck.
Coming up, wrestling addiction.
And he said to me at the time, Dad, I do take steroids.
And later,
nobody could believe that Chris Benoit would be capable of this.
Being a professional wrestler is a painful job.
Chris Benoit was no exception. In the summer of 2001, he was away from the ring recovering from neck surgery.
Chris really wanted to perform, and to be on the sidelines is really hard for somebody who'd spent his whole career out performing for people. That all of a sudden be at home had to have been frustrating for him.
You're afraid to get hurt. You couldn't afford to get hurt. It's really simple math. You get hurt, you don't have a job, and you're a liability now. They don't have any need for a hurt wrestler.
Chris Benoit was looking for a shortcut back to health so he could re-enter the ring.
They don't have a retirement plan. They don't have an injury plan. They have to keep working in order to get paid. And so a wrestler, it's his own best interest to say, I'm not hurt, and then go out there and perform, even if he's not at 100%.
Many wrestlers turn to both prescription and illegal drugs in order to continue performing.
Some guys that use a lot of painkillers, because that's really only way if you're going to continue to wrestle and you're in pain. I mean, that's really the only way you're going to be able to survive is if you use painkillers. Then it becomes a situation where it becomes an addiction.
And all the wrestlers have these little black fanny packs in front of them. And it was kind of hilarious because they're like mini drugstores. If you open them up, sometimes you'd be talking to them and they just open them up and they'd not even look to see what they grab and they're popping a pill.
Generally speaking, you're your own doctor on the road, so you have certain medications that you'll have with you in case you get hurt, in case you need to sleep, muscle relaxers. Everyone's kind of got their own little medicine kit.
They had to sometimes medicate that, both legally and under the table.
I think it was all very subtle in the beginning, but then there was the wrestlers always overdo things. They started taking, like one wouldn't work, so two, you tried two. And right from the start, there was guys dying of prescription medication problems.
Chris's mentor, the Dynamite Kid, had fallen into that trap.
The first time I saw him, or even suspected that he was doing steroids, I found a needle in his shaving kit, and he told me it was a B12 shot. I believed him, but I soon found out B12 was red, and I was like, what is this stuff? And it said Decadurable, and he had gotten it in Germany. He was probably already on it for about a year. Tom was always short-tempered, but, I mean, he became even more so the more steroids that he took.
Instead of learning from the Dynamite Kid's mistakes, Chris succumbed to the pressures faced by other wrestlers. Scared he might lose his spot in the WWE, Benoit started using painkillers and performance-enhancing drugs to speed up his recovery.
Steroids are really basically used to repair damage to muscular tissue and recover from injuries. If you hurt yourself and break your leg or tear your muscle, the doctor will give you a therapeutic dosage of it. There are some people that use it simply so they can build muscle, become bigger.
Steroids started becoming much more easily available, not just in wrestling, but in the general public. And so he certainly got introduced to steroids.
In May of 2002, Chris made his WWE comeback. He'd been away from his fans for 11 months.
He was sort of a humble guy. He was a respectful, humble guy who was considered like a family man, and he wasn't like a troublemaker behind the scenes or anything like that. He was thought of as this just really dedicated athlete, dedicated family man.
Wrestlers have this innate drive to get out there and perform for the audience. That's where they get the real thrill, is from the audience.
I tell you, there is no woman, there is no drug, there is no that can give you that adrenaline rush when you hear your music play and the people pop. And I would just come out and throw it up. 20,000 people would throw it up and bang, boom, 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 boom. Explosions all around me and the place is going crazy. You know, you just get goosebumps all over every time. The adrenaline level is so high. It's a lot of the reasons why the guys can do the superhuman things that we could do out there, because you can't fake gravity. You know?
The crowds were thrilled to have Chris back, but his family began to notice disturbing changes in the 35-year-old wrestler.
He wouldn't put his garbage out on the street in fear of someone going through it. He would take, he had a driver that would pick him up at the airport and drive him home and tell him to take different routes all the time in case someone was following him. They used to talk about putting Daniel in a secured school so that no one could get at him, a private school.
That same year, Chris's wife Nancy filed for divorce.
You know, the life expectancy for married couples in wrestling was horrible. You know, it's a huge divorce rate. You get caught up in this schedule to where you're constantly on the road, and people think that's a real glamorous life, and it's not.
But several months later, Nancy withdrew the divorce papers and her request for a restraining order.
There was a situation where she said he had become violent and broken some furniture, and she got a restraining order, and we can only imagine that then they ended up, deciding they really loved each other, let's stay together for our child's sake. So I think it was one of those hot and cold relationships, and the most passionate ones do have a lot of high drama.
As Chris and Nancy struggled to keep their marriage together, Chris got some tragic news about his dearest friend, WWE wrestling star Eddie Guerrero.
Eddie Guerrero died alone in a hotel room in Minneapolis, and it's one of those sad stories. You didn't immediately know what happened to him and why it happened.
I was on the corporate jet that day, flew into Minneapolis with Vince McMahon, and we were detoured to the Marriott Hotel. We saw the ambulance out front, and as soon as I saw that, I said something's bad wrong.
Eventually it was proven that his heart had given out, essentially from years of abuse, and that was both with the steroids and also with the different other pain pills and whatever he may have done over the years to abuse that heart. Really sad ending, and it was certainly a huge star on TV at the time when he died as well, which made it even more shocking.
So Eddie made a big impact on a lot of people, and one of the lives that Eddie impacted, and Eddie's death really affected was Chris Benoit. Chris and Eddie were really, really tight.
They would work out together, they would travel together, spend all the time together, and they'd be able to talk to one another about what was going on in their lives.
Following the death, Chris's father Michael voiced concern for his son.
I had a very serious conversation with him about the steroid issue after the death of Eddie Guerrero. I said to him at the time, I said, Chris, an enlarged heart from steroid use, I hope that you're not following in his footsteps. And he said to me at the time, Dad, I do take steroids. I take a very limited amount, and if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to continue wrestling. The reason I take it is because of my broken neck in 2001.
Coming up, a horrific discovery.
I think we're all pretty confident it was a murder-suicide.
And later,
I kept looking at the phone, our caller ID, to see if it was the National Enquirer.
In 2005, World Wrestling Entertainment's Chris Benoit mourned the loss of his best friend and fellow wrestler, Eddie Guerrero.
He all of a sudden was a lost man. He didn't have his moral compass. He didn't have that person to talk to, his sounding board.
Chris's wife Nancy suggested he keep a journal to help him through his rough time.
He was quoting scripture in a lot of his writings. Chris was not a religious guy. He writes in one, he's telling Eddie Guerrero about a dream that he had. And the dream was that his mom and dad were dead, had been killed, and that was myself and my wife. And that him and Nancy were trying desperately to get to Daytona Beach to save her mother and father, that there were very powerful people after them. And then when they got to Daytona Beach, Nancy's mom and dad had perished too, and they were running for their life, Chris and Nancy. And what these powerful people wanted to do was take his Bible away from him. And then at the end of this story, he says that this is a dream, but on the end of this story, he goes on to say that, Eddie, I'm sure that there's a message in here, but I'm not sure what that message is. I mean, it was extremely disturbing for me to even read it.
For the next 2 years, Benoit hid his dark thoughts from friends and family. Finally, in June 2007, Chris's emotional state seemed to reach a breaking point.
He had called me on June 17th, which was Father's Day, to wish me happy Father's Day. And I said to him at the time, I said, Chris, you know, where are you today? And he said, Dad, he said, I'm on the road traveling to a venue. I wish I could be home with my family.
Then, on Saturday, June 23, 2007, Chris missed a match in Texas, telling the WWE he had a family emergency.
He mentioned that his family had food poisoning and one or both of them was throwing up blood.
WWE officials reached out to Benoit to reschedule the event.
It was a cause for concern because he was such a committed wrestler. This was an unusual situation. Not only that, when they did try to reach him, they were unable to reach him. So he was not answering his cell phone and he was not returning phone calls.
The next day, Chris's troubling behavior continued.
He canceled out of the pay-per-view event as well, and then sent some very unusual text messages, including some to coworkers that were kind of inappropriate for the relationship he had with people, like telling people he loved them, ones about giving out the address, explaining where the dogs were, just sort of very odd messages.
The unusual text messages prompted the WWE to ask Fayetteville authorities to check in on the Benoit residence.
I think when people are receiving text messages, almost giving instruction, but not really. My dogs are here. This is my physical address. Almost like he's letting somebody know. They got a bit weirded out, and they decided at a certain point, you know what, maybe we should call the police.
The following day at 4 p.m., a patrol car was dispatched to Chris's home. Police entered to find a horrific scene.
Officials say the wrestler strangled his wife on Friday, suffocated his son on Saturday, and proceeded to hang himself from a weight machine on Sunday.
I think we're all pretty confident it was a murder-suicide.
I was on my way home, about 5 o'clock at night. I was almost at my driveway, and my cell phone rang, and it was my cousin in Ottawa. And he said, Mike, is it true? And I said, is what true? And I looked down my driveway, and a fellow by the name of Scott Zur that was a good friend of Chris's. I said to my cousin on the phone, just a second. And as I pulled up, Scott came over and said to me, he's gone. That's how I found out.
Nobody could believe that Chris Benoit would be capable of this.
I was pretty sure it must be a mistake. Chris would never do that to his wife and kid. Not the Chris I knew.
The thing that was so hard even now to accept about Chris is that he was capable of doing that. You'll never make me believe that he was in his right mind. He couldn't be. You know, I just lost it. I started crying.
Didn't understand it. Had no idea what could have led to this total breakdown. Absolutely, just the world became very black for us.
Wrestling fans and the general public were stunned when details of the grisly killings were released.
Chris put a Bible beside Nancy's body, put a Bible beside his son's body. 3 to 4 months prior to this happening, his neighbor told me that he used to walk around with a set of rosary beads around his neck when he was at home. So, this is totally out of character for him to have done.
And who knows what turmoil he was in. And no one knows what goes on behind closed doors.
You had people who were closer to him, obviously, who were traumatized and seek counseling or whatever it may be. And other guys who felt like this was somebody they looked up to, who was a bit of a mentor for them, and they betrayed by somebody they loved and loved to watch.
Toxicology reports later revealed Chris had 10 times the normal levels of testosterone in his system, the result of steroid use.
It's an ongoing dispute. People will say that amount of testosterone will lead to rage.
There is absolutely no medical evidence out there that would tie my son's behavior at that time of the tragedy to steroids. They keep talking in the press. Medical experts say that this is drugs and steroids. It's so far from the truth.
Coming up, a possible explanation.
This is a picture of a staining of a normal brain, and this is a picture of Chris Benoit's brain.
Over the weekend of June 23, 2007, Chris Benoit murdered his wife and 7-year-old son in their Fayetteville home before taking his own life.
I think that's what I'm struck by most through all of this, is that there's a 7-year-old little boy who's dead. And I don't think we'll ever be able to wrap our minds around that.
A toxicology test found high doses of steroids in Chris's body.
He had been living on steroids for over half his life.
But many suspected it was more than drugs that threw Chris over the edge.
Can't accept roid rage as being more than a spark that maybe started it. There's just so many other things that would have been going on in his life.
Chris Benoit never showed any of the signs of roid rage ever in his life. You have to abuse it badly to suffer from what they call roid rage, and I've seen it. And I've seen the effects that it's had on guys, and it's a real thing. But Chris wasn't roid rage, and he wasn't a drug addict, and he wasn't an alcoholic. I think it was something deeper.
I never ever saw him lose his temper. He had a good sense of humor. He was a lovable guy. He was a friendly guy. He was the kind of guy that got a door for a lady.
Days before Chris's funeral, his father Michael received a troubling phone call.
I got the call from Chris Nowinski. Needless to say, when I got the call, I've got someone on the end of the line that I have no idea who he is, that is asking me to release my son's remains to him so that he can study his brain.
Most people, after a tragedy, especially of this magnitude, don't answer their phones, but by some miracle, he actually answered my call.
I kept looking at the phone, our caller ID, to see if it was the National Enquirer.
Chris Nowinski is a former wrestler who heads up the Sports Legacy Institute, which studies the effects of brain concussions on athletes.
I was actually sitting in a restaurant in Washington, D.C. after having a meeting with 4 congressmen regarding head injury issues. And my BlackBerry started blowing up with text messages saying, the Benoit family was found dead. I knew about Chris's massive concussion history.
Nowinski believed Benoit suffered from chronic traumatic encephalopathy, a condition that may have played a part in his killings.
Chris was our first case that somebody actually knew. Chris Benoit told me he had more concussions than he could remember, which, knowing he had a 23-year career and some of the things he'd done in the ring, I didn't doubt. Because I knew him and because I knew who he used to be, and because this was so, so out of character and so, just tragic. I honestly felt obligated to somewhat, protect his memory, that I had at least find an answer.
But he had to move fast.
I called everybody I knew was in charge, whether it's the police or the medical examiners, and I said, "Don't get rid of the brain." I told myself that nothing was going to stop me, and trust me, a lot of people and a lot of things tried to stop me.
Nowinski was able to secure Chris Benoit's brain for testing.
When we got back the results from the analysis of Chris Benoit's brain, what was found was that he had the most severe case of chronic traumatic encephalopathy that we'd seen.
This is a picture of a staining of a normal brain showing normal brain cells. And this is a picture of Chris Benoit's brain in which you see many tau protein depositions, these irregular, jagged, black areas, which is toxic to nerve cells and to nerve fibers and causes death of nerve cells and death of nerve fibers. We found the greatest amount of it that we have seen in any of the brains of traumatic encephalopathy athletes that we've studied so far. So Chris Benoit not only had it, but he had it in far greater amounts. It was scattered throughout his entire brain.
Basically, he was not operating full capacity anymore. His ability to think was diminished, his ability to control his emotions was diminished.
Years of repeated blows to the head may have contributed to the deterioration of Chris's mental state.
In every possible part of his brain, there is significant evidence, past evidence of people with traumatic brain injury. The paranoia, which my son had, the violence.
That this undoubtedly contributed to some of the very irrational behavior that he exhibited, not just during the last weekend of his life, but as his diary documents and others who knew him have documented through the last several years of his life.
Looking back, it sounds like there was signs that Chris Benoit was a man in a lot of trouble. Looking back, we see that he was depressed. We see that he had living on painkillers way too long. He'd been living on steroids for over half his life. He was having marital troubles. He was kind of a private guy. Some of the closest people in their lives did see the signs.
The results of Nowinski's tests showed the Benoit tragedy might have been avoided.
Had it been known that Chris was suffering this damage, and had he stopped incurring those injuries, and had he been away from all injuries for an extensive period of time, it's possible that if he'd stopped soon enough and had rested his brain at an appropriate time, that he could have recovered.
We had talked in terms about him retiring, and they had offered him positions within the company, but he had said to me at the time, "Dad, they're paying me so much money, why would I retire? I'm doing something that I love to do, why would I quit?"
Coming up, critics weigh in.
The concept of taking a real chair over the head anywhere is ridiculous.
Following the suicide of WWE wrestler Chris Benoit and his murder of wife Nancy and son Daniel, lab reports confirmed the incident wasn't simply a case of roid rage.
I think it was a lot of things, different painkillers, maybe some alcohol, maybe depression over his marriage and his role with the WWE at the time. Certainly steroids could have been a huge factor, even the concussions that he had suffered.
But Chris was skilled at keeping his problems hidden.
It was a pride thing for him. You don't show weakness, and when you're hurt, you need to take that time off. But you don't do it because it's a pride thing. To take time off is a sign of weakness, and so he didn't get the help he needed.
And Chris had no medical history to warn doctors.
We're not aware that he was ever treated, examined for a concussion, so it's more probable than not that his family physician or personal physician really didn't even know about the head injury issue.
His medical records are all tied up with the DEA on an ongoing investigation on their part because of the doctor that they're presently have indicted, and he's facing charges of whether, in fact, when Chris had his broken neck, whether he was prescribed steroids.
Benoit's case gave wrestling critics ammo to question the WWE's involvement.
The stunts are getting more and more difficult and more dangerous. The whiplash effect from jumping off ladders at heights is enough to produce concussion in people. The concept of taking a real chair over the head anywhere is ridiculous in the sense of the fact that can induce brain damage. So the stunts have gotten more dangerous and probably unacceptably dangerous.
When you know that being bigger is better for your career, there's a hell of an incentive to be bigger. My 4th year in the business, I was working a show locally, and the one promoter who also wrestles like, man, you look great, what are you on? I'm like, nothing. No, seriously, what are you on? And that's so typical of the attitude in that 10 minutes ago you thought I looked great and wanted to look like me. And then when you realize that I'm actually natural and could be bigger, all of a sudden I'm not big enough.
WWE sort of went in 2 phases. There was the defense posture they took, as in not all our guys are on steroids. This is wrong to just immediately say it's roid rage. But back behind the scenes, there was a lot of compassion. They tried to get counseling for some of their people. They tried to come to terms with how this could happen to one of the performers.
On the upside, Chris's case brought the public's attention to the dangers of steroid use.
I think they're just starting to change their ways now. I think some of the main guys that have been on the roids are starting to come off of it. They're actually going through with the suspensions that they weren't going through before because they're under the eye now. Everybody's watching now.
I see more of a crackdown on the drug use side of it. With WWE, a lot of their sizzle is ladder matches and hitting guys over the head with chairs and jumping from high heights to crack somebody. And so there's a lot of physical stuff going on.
I know the WWE has a wellness program now in which they are drug testing wrestlers and performers, and I think it's a commendable step, and hopefully will eliminate the dependency on steroids to get bigger, and the use of painkillers and sleeping pills and uppers and downers, that may show up in their system during the drug tests.
As the debate continued, friends and fans remembered the wrestler before the shocking weekend of June 23rd, 2007.
He spent 22 years in the industry and gave his all every time he went out into the ring.
He's always a nice, polite kid. I always thought the world of him.
As for the future, Chris Benoit's memory will live on through those determined to stop the wrestling world from claiming other lives.
I fear that if some of the professional wrestlers don't change their behaviors, that they will, at a later point in their life, have traumatic encephalopathy issues. Hopefully none of them to the extent of Chris Benoit.
Hopefully, this will raise awareness and they will do something about it. And the public, the huge demand on bigger, bigger, bigger.
These are shortcuts they're resorting to achieve that look and maybe to perform better, maybe to deal with injuries, but ultimately it's killing their bodies and cutting their careers short. So, I think the wrestlers have